The top 10 worst kings of England by me, Embrace Historia. I'd like to think after making content for quite a few years on the many medieval kings of England that my own top 10 list would be hopefully unique. So let's begin. Number 10 starts with an Anglo-Saxon king of England, King Edwig. And as we're at the first king, let me quickly explain how I rank the kings based on how they kept their oaths and obligations to the people of England. The kings of England being at the top meant while they enjoyed enormous amounts of wealth and power, they still had to keep the realm and its people safe and looked after. And not surprisingly, a lot of English kings failed to keep their oaths and to keep the people of England safe, which was their job. This is how my opinions on the kings has formed over the years, how they've looked after the people. Over the course of the centuries, the oaths and obligations sworn during the coronation have changed, but the main aspects of keeping the people of England safe was still there. To offer an example, here's an extract from one of the earliest coronations of King Edgar, who was the younger brother of our number 10 pick, Edwig. Quote, "Let thy hand be strengthened, and thy right hand exalted. Justice and judgment are the preparations of thy throne. Let mercy and truth go before thy face." And a more direct quote comes from the coronation of Richard the Lionheart. According to custom, he swore that he would all the days of his life observe peace, honor, and reverence towards God, the Holy Church, and its ordinances. He also swore that he would exercise true justice and equity towards the people committed to his charge. He also swore that he would abrogate bad laws and unjust customs, if any such had been introduced into his kingdom, and would enact good laws and observe the same without fraud or evil intent. With that, you should be able to understand how I'm ranking the kings. Moving back to Edwig, the sole reason he is on this list is because of his weakness in keeping the Kingdom of England together. The main sources we have about Edwig's reign are not kind to him. The lives of St. Oswald and St. Egwin and the early life of St. Dunstan both disparage him, particularly with the line from the early life of St. Dunstan, quote, "Meanwhile, Edgar's brother breathed his last, dying a wretched death, because he had gone astray and forsaken the just judgments of his God." By the time of his death, the Kingdom of England had been split in two, which in my opinion is a failure regarding the oaths. Quote, "As the years went by, it came about that King Edwig was totally abandoned by the people north of the Thames. They despised him for his impertinent discharge of the power entrusted to him. The wise and sensible he destroyed in a spirit of idle hatred, replacing them with ignoramuses like himself, to whom he took a liking. But when everyone conspired to desert him, they chose, with God's guidance, Edwig's brother, Edgar, as king, to bring the just stroke of the imperial rod upon the unjust, and to guard the well-disposed in peace under the same rod of equity. With the whole people as witness, the kingdoms were divided along lines laid down by the wise, the famous River Thames becoming the boundary between the two. Edgar's thus chosen to be king by the Northerners. Just one final thing before moving on to number 9. The sources are obviously biased against Edwig, and then later go on to praise his brother and successor, King Edgar, heavily, so just be aware of that. But also remember, the Kingdom of England was split in two. Number 9 is Henry VI. I have quite a lot of sympathy for King Henry VI due to his mental health issues. For the last several years of his reign, he was nothing more than a puppet. Henry's reign is a pertinent reminder that a weak medieval monarch can be destructive and cause major political issues in the country. which in King Henry VI's case was the War of the Roses. A civil war is one major reason why certain kings will be on this list, while there were other factors that brought on the War of the Roses, going back to the reign of Edward III. King Henry's weak rule enabled the spark that lit the fire of civil war. It also didn't help that the few men in Henry's government were brutally killed by an angry mob. One uprising was known as the Complaints of the Poor Commons of Kent in 1450. You can read the whole complaint, the link is in the references. The final line in the opening paragraph basically tells us what's occurring. We, considering that the king our sovereign lord, by the insatiable, covetous, malicious persons that daily and nightly are about his highness, and daily inform him that good is evil and evil is good. Their complaint tells us that they believe the king is being led astray by bad counsellors, which isn't a good look for a ruling monarch. This is before the start of the War of the Roses. I think if Henry didn't suffer from his mental health ailments, then he probably would have been known more so as a peaceful, devout king. One example I can offer is Henry's visit to Coventry in September 1451, which from the mayor's account puts the king in a kingly light. Thomas Littleton, who was then recorder, said some pleasantries to the king. Our sovereign responded again thus: "Sirs, I thank you for your warming reception and orderly behaviour, especially for your good behaviour during the past year, when the people of the city have been the best behaved in my realm. I also thank you for the present you have just given us. This present was a ton of wine and 20 large fat oxen." The king continued by commanding them to govern his city well and see that the peace was well preserved, as it had been in times past, and promised that he would be a good lord to them. While the War of the Roses isn't the most devastating civil war in British history, the chaos of the Civil War, the poor inept government, the over-reliance on royal favourites, and the rise of powerful nobles causing royal authority to wither, plus Henry's mental health problems, adds him to this list. Number 8. Richard III. Loser. He failed in one of the worst possible ways, by dying in battle and a claimant taking the throne. That's the brutal end of it, although in Richard's case it was possibly a halberd to the back of the head. There are other reasons why he's one of the worst kings of England, because when you share an association with another worst king of England, you're going to be a PR nightmare. And that association is with King John, whose spoilers does appear on this list. They're both accused of murdering their nephews. Richard is accused of killing the princes in the Tower, and John is accused of killing Duke Arthur of Brittany. The whole disappearance of the princes in the Tower is a messy business, and while there's many different opinions on if Richard had a hand in their disappearance, politically at the time, it was prudent in Richard's case to make the boys disappear, because if the two boys, named Edward and Richard, grew up to be anything like their father, Edward IV, who can be described as built like a brick shithouse, 6'3", handsome, charismatic, brave, all the traits that made him a popular and the winner over the fight for the throne, until his premature death threw all the political stability out the window. Now imagine if the boys turned out like that. They would be a very attractive alternative to some powerful nobles who say wanted to get rid of Richard, for example, the Stanleys. So by killing the boys, there is some brutal political sense in it for the time period. As I've said, there's many theories and opinions on the whole issue, and there's a great way of encapsulating all of these opinions at the King Richard III Visitor Centre in Leicester, which has an interactive touch game where you go through most of the major theories on the boy's disappearance, and at any point you can pick which theory you agree with. and at the end it shows you the results of what theories visitors picked. The highest percentage being 29% in favour of Lady Margaret Beaufort, Henry Tudor's mother, which I think is laughable. Anyway, I'm getting off topic. To summarise, Richard is on this list because he lost the throne, thus failing his oaths and the fact he was accused of such a heinous crime. Number 7. Edward II. This guy wasn't up to the task of being a king. Inheriting a deeply difficult and expensive war with Scotland, which Edward's actions didn't help and only made the war worse for the people of England and Scotland. The same issues again appear: royal favouritism towards woefully unqualified men, such as Piers Gaveston, clashes with the ideas of being a medieval king, and a lack of political wit. All of these can be attributed to Edward's reign. Edward wasn't some villain. As a normal bloke, Edward would be quite pleasant, but as king, he was terrible. And in a way, I do feel sorry for him, especially when you read what he cried when forced with his abdication. I greatly lament that I have so utterly failed my people, but I could not be other than I am. Catherine Warner's biography on Edward II is the best book to read on Edward. Number 6. Ethelred the Unready. While holding the distinction of being the longest reigning Anglo-Saxon king of England, he is also the worst Anglo-Saxon king of England. Ethelred had terrible luck and judgment. His brother was murdered and Ethelred was too young to rule, so infighting between different factions don't help. Then there was a huge uptick in Viking raids and attacks. The destruction from those raids were on another level, and when Ethelred was of age to be king, most times he tried to fix or help improve the situations. It either failed or exacerbated the problems. Appeasement did not work for Ethelred, but also he just had shit people working for him, bad advisors, bad generals, and a greedy nobility, which Ethelred simply couldn't fix in time. Plus, he did lose his throne to Sven Forkbeard, who luckily for Ethelred, died shortly after. But even as Sven's son Canute was invading England, Ethelred's lack of drive due to illness and hindering his son Edmund I's attempts to resist this new invasion just added another failure on top of Ethelred's reign. Number 5. King Stephen and the Anarchy. The main reason is the length of the civil war. It went on far too long, and that was bad for kingly business, as the nobles were building castles and counter-castles, and even clashing with the clergy over building churches on land which didn't belong to the nobility. The problem with this period is a lot of the sources say different things on how tumultuous the anarchy was. I'm of the opinion that it was more damaging in the Midlands and southwest of England than the north of England, as in the Midland cities, such as Worcester and Oxford, were damaged heavily during the Civil War, and some historians push back on the term anarchy to describe the Civil War as not being close to anarchy. My point is that Stephen's inability to end the Civil War in victory, and again the length of the Civil War, because Stephen, despite the circumstances of how he obtained the throne, was the king, which meant he had the obligations to look after the Kingdom of England and its people, which, as England was in a state of civil war for so long, King Stephen failed, and that is why he's on this list. Number 4, William I for the harrying of the North, an utter failure of kingship. I'll let the sources talk. What treatment he meted out to those who managed to survive the great slaughter, I forbear to tell.
Never did William commit so much cruelty. To his lasting disgrace, he yielded to his worst impulse, and set no bounds to his fury, condemning the innocent and the guilty to a common fate. In the fullness of his wrath, he ordered the corn and the cattle, with the implements of husbandry and every sort of provisions, to be collected in heaps and set on fire till the whole was consumed, and thus destroyed at once all that could serve for the support of life in the whole country lying beyond the Humber. There followed, consequently, so great a scarcity in England in the ensuing years, and severe famine involved the innocent and unarmed population in such misery, that in a Christian nation, more than 100,000 souls of both sexes and all ages perished of want. On many occasions in the course of the present history, I have been free to extol William according to his merits, but I dare not commend him for an act which levelled both the bad and the good together in one common ruin, by the infliction of a consuming famine. For when I see that innocent children, youths in the prime of their age, and grey-haired old men perish from hunger, I am more disposed to pity the sorrows and sufferings of the wretched people than to undertake the hopeless task of screening one who was guilty of such wholesale massacre by lying flatteries. I assert, moreover, that such barbarous homicide could not pass unpunished.
Number 3. King John. The king who had to be reminded of what his role was. John was a thoroughly unpleasant man. I should know, I'm the idiot who made a 3-hour documentary on him. The guy was a dickhead, even by medieval standards, and ultimately his actions led to an invasion of his realm that he was supposed to protect. John ran the exchequer to its limits to raise funds for his wars, which he lost. Remember how I said at the start of the video, when I quoted Richard the Lionheart's coronation oaths, observe the saying without fraud or evil intent? John was the man who ignored these oaths, and for the barons to actually revolt against you and bring in a foreigner to take your place, you know you've done something terribly wrong. Also, the disappearance of his nephew Arthur, who was imprisoned by John, isn't a great look. John's biggest issue was his personality. He just had such an easy time annoying his allies, which when you've got a vast amount of territory to rule, you need good, steadfast allies, which John did inherit. However, he would lose most of them through his actions. It also didn't help that his biggest rival, Philip, the King of France, was one of the best kings France ever produced. But it wasn't just the nobility that John picked fights with, but also the Pope. In fact, John holds the special title of being the first King of England to be excommunicated, and England was placed under an interdict. This might not seem bad to us, but in the Middle Ages, this would have been horrible for the people of England. I've neglected the king's role in the spiritual side his role played for the people of England, as I wanted to focus more on how well looked after the people of England were. But John's that special case in how his actions inflicted more misery on the people of England because of the interdict. Number 2. Charles I, the most unrepentant king on this list. His actions led to the death of thousands and the destruction and damage of many towns, cities, castles, churches, cathedrals, etc. I really hate Charles as king, but also the whole wars, which we can call the British Civil Wars, or War of the Three Kingdoms. If Oliver Cromwell took the crown when he was offered it, he would be joint with Charles on this list. But thankfully, Cromwell was not a king, in all but name. Let me give you a very quick rundown of the Civil Wars, from 1639 to 1652. Charlie Boy is king of 3 kingdoms: England, Ireland, and Scotland. All 3 nations have different parliaments and religions. They all worship the same thing, they just can't agree on how to do it. And Charles is not capable of managing these religious expectations. Add into the mixture a newish type of kingship, the divine rights of kings, which, to summarize, it means the king can pretty much do what he wants and only answer to God, which automatically contradicts the idea of a parliament, which Charles dissolves for a while until he needed funds for a war. Parliament reconvenes and tells Charles to piss off, whilst giving him a big fat list of all the problems in the nations that needs to be addressed. After failing to arrest 5 members of Parliament and fleeing, Charles raised his standard in Nottingham and started raising an army, as does Parliament. What follows is the world's worst team picking, As towns and cities across England start picking sides, families are torn apart over the issues, and death and destruction follows, committed by both sides. But we will focus on Charles, who blew up quite a lot of buildings and bridges around the Midlands, at places such as Bidford-on-Avon, Evesham, Oxford, etc. Charles also blew up the remains of Reading Abbey. Then we have all the battles and sieges. Hundreds of thousands of people died, and most of it can be traced back to Charles. What vexes me the most is the fact that Charles never showed any remorse for his actions, his plotting and scheming to get back power after his capture, trying to pit the different parliaments against each other, although both the English and Scottish parliaments weren't exactly best friends. The 4th of June, 1648. The Scots have published a manifesto containing their reasons for taking arms if the English will not amicably do what they ask, which is observance of the covenant, release of the king, abolition of bishops, establishment of the Presbyterian religion, disbanding the army, and the extirpation of independents and other sects which prevail in that army. That quote is from an account by the Venetian ambassadors living in London during the time period. There's also the final letter Charles sent to his son, the future Charles II, and again, no remorse, no understanding of the death and destruction he's caused. The whole letter is rather long, and I want to focus on this extract. Once a king of 3 flourishing kingdoms, whom God thought fit to honour, not only with the sceptre and government of them, but also with the suffering many indignities and untimely death for them, while I study to preserve the rights of church, the power of the laws, the honour of my crown, the privilege of parliaments, the liberties of my people, and my own conscience, which I thank God is dear to me than 1,000 kingdoms. Charles failed pretty much all of those points on a cataclysmic level. Now we turn to the king who started the divine rights of kings in England. Number 1. Roses are red, violets are blue. Henry VIII is the worst king of England, and I'll prove it to you. Henry is the first English king to practice the divine rights of kings, elevating his power even more so by making himself head of the Church of England. These actions of the divine rights of kings sowed the seeds for the British Civil Wars under Charles I. My own opinion on why Henry is the worst king of England also stems from the destruction brought by the dissolution of the monasteries, not just in England, but also Wales and Ireland. I visit a lot of heritage sites, and I also work in heritage. It's so frustrating that in most places, Henry's taint is always present. So much heritage was lost, regardless of the religious aspects. You can visit many places in the UK which have a full, rich history, and then its end point is always with Henry's reign. It sucks. But there's other parts of Henry's reign. For example, the rough wooing in Scotland and the burning of the city of Edinburgh, the Laws of Wales Acts of 1535 and 1542, which sought to destroy Welsh identity by replacing the Welsh language with English, the Tudor conquest of Ireland. The effects of that still linger to this day. For Henry, I would need a whole hour or more to go over everything in detail, which I will do in the future. There is just so much. The treatment of his wives, those poor women, they didn't deserve being married to Henry. Some historical figures have had a similar view to my own on King Henry. Charles Dickens thought that Henry was most intolerable ruffian, a disgrace to human nature, and a blot of blood and grease on the history of England. The final quote I want to offer on Henry comes from David Hume, a Scottish philosopher. Notwithstanding his cruelty, his extortion, his violence, his arbitrary administration, this prince not only acquired the regard of his subjects, but never was the object of their hatred. In that age was so thoroughly subdued that, like Eastern slaves, they were inclined to admire those acts of violence and tyranny which were exercised over themselves at their own expense. And that concludes my own opinion on the 10 worst kings of England. The 10 best kings of England. We will be ranking them based on the same principle as the 10 worst kings of England, which, to summarize from that video, is how well looked after the people of England were during the king's reign, which include, depending on the time period, daily concerns for the average person, which was the majority of the population, the biggest concern being agriculture, food supplies, the welfare of their families, the plight of their soul, paying tithe, market days, and of course, the most important, brewing a good batch of ale and not getting fined for brewing a bad batch of ale. As most of the kings of England from 927 to 1707 were medieval, their actions played a major role in how well the people of England could prosper. A bad king letting an invading army ravage and loot around England doesn't bode well for the average person in England, as well as the succession, which will also play a part in the ranking, as while there were good kings who ruled England well, their failure to either secure or name a successor is factored into their rankings. Let's begin. Number 10, Edmund I. The second king of the English after his brother Athelstan. Edmund is on this list for keeping the newly formed Kingdom of England mostly together, as England was comprised of Mercia, Wessex, Northumbria, and the Danelaw, and could be split from the king's control. That did happen, but Edmund managed to regain control of these lands, which drew praise from the many different chroniclers of different ages, from a praise poem in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles to later chroniclers such as Roger of Howden, William of Malmesbury, John of Worcester, etc. Remember, this is a dangerous time for the people of Britain, as Viking attacks could come at any moment. Edmund was a capable leader who could protect his people. However, sadly, Edmund's reign ended too soon, as he was murdered, dying from a stab wound. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicles don't give us much details, but John of Worcester and William of Malmesbury give a more detailed account. They're writing much later. I'll quote John of Worcester's account. On the feast of St. Augustine, being Tuesday, the 7th of the calendar of June, Edmund, the great king of England, was stabbed to death at the royal villa called Pucklechurch by Leof, a ruffian thief, while attempting to defend his Stuart from being murdered by the robber. The king thus perished after a reign of 5 years and 7 months. His body was carried to Glastonbury and buried by St. Dunstan, the abbot. Number 9, Edward I. Known for restoring royal authority during the Second Barons' War by defeating Simon de Montfort at the Battle of Evesham. Edward was instrumental in the establishment of Parliament as a use of government policy. Edward can be described as one of the quintessential medieval kings. One of the best biographies of Edward is even titled A Great and Terrible King by Mark Morris, as while the people of England during Edward's reign might have revered him for his kingship, the people of Wales and Scotland would have seen him as a monster. But that also works in Edward's favour as a medieval king. Edward was also able to take advantage of the population growth of England by the growth of trade fairs and markets, which meant England was becoming richer, and thus so did the king. And Edward used these funds to build the many castles around Britain. There was also the continued growth of the wool trade. I've said it many times, but England is great for rearing sheep, and Edward took full advantage of this economic growth. There's also the expansion of Parliament, which is credited to Edward's reign. Both constitutional and economic themes have their social dimensions. Thus, the presence in Parliament in the reign of Edward I of not only lords, bishops and great abbots, but also a commons, demonstrated the growing wealth of townsmen and knights of the shire and their growing consequence in the local communities which they represented. While the fact that townsmen and knights sat together encouraged the merchant and feudal classes, divided in many political societies, to think of their common interests. Edward seemed to possess unboundless energy. This can be witnessed even by his last journey towards Scotland, but not before dying not far from Carlisle. And this is the major reason he's not higher on the list. Edward's war with Scotland, and in part with France, was terrible for the people in England, especially in the north. High taxation, reprisal attacks from the Scots, fostered even more hostility over the years, as by 1230, the Scots were declaring to the Pope, "As long as 100 of us remain alive, we will never on any conditions submit to the dominion of the English." Number 8. James I. The first Scottish King of England. Edward I would have been rolling in his grave that a Scot united the kingdoms under one king, as opposed to Edward's attempt at trying to turn Scotland into a mere province. While the two kingdoms were still separate from each other, James being king of both meant peace in England and Scotland. This was particularly good news for the people of northern England and southern Scotland. James being the longest reigning Scottish king meant that when he came to the English throne in 1603, he was already well versed in kingship, as being a Scottish king is a rather hard job. To understand why that was, watch my video, The Unlucky Lives of Scottish Kings Named James, for more. James, like many of his predecessors, was a boy king, which meant that Scotland would again go through a rough period of Scottish lords fighting for control of the young king. As the Scottish chronicler Robert Lindsay stated, "The king's lords paid no regard to the common good of the country, nor to the honour of the king, or gave proper respect to the glory of God or the true church, but simply considered their own financial interests." Thankfully, James managed to survive and prosper as King of Scotland until he achieved what had been his goal for many years, the throne of England, in 1603, even lamenting crossing the borderlands. "Where I thought to have employed you with some armour, I employ only your hearts, to the good prospering of me in my success and journey." James's desire now was to rule as King of Britain. However, that would not come to pass until 1707, as both the English and Scottish parliaments objected. Yet James would have to maintain the peace in an increasingly religious diverse nations, which he managed to do, unlike his successor. The fact that the peace was so long achieved in Britain meant that Scottish warriors had to seek employment in Central Europe during the 30 Years' War. However, there are some major criticisms that stopped James from being higher on this list. 1. James practiced the divine rights of kings, which, as we know, was one of the leading causes of the British Civil Wars. Secondly, James heavily believed in witchcraft. Thousands of people would be killed because of these so-called trials. And finally, the plantation of Ulster. Number 7. Edward III, another king who restored royal authority after the damaging rule of his father, Edward II. Edward shares many similarities with his grandfather, Edward I. both capable of conducting effective military campaigns. Edward III's major war was the 116 Years' War with France. Edward is also credited with establishing an early sense of English nationalism, making St. George the patron saint of England, and creating the Knights of the Garter. Edward's reign also featured the highest population England had during the Middle Ages, before being decimated by the Black Death. One aspect of King Edward's rule which benefited the people was the charters of liberties for various towns and cities. One example is the city of Coventry, which in 1345 was granted a charter which allowed them to choose their own mayor and gave the city mostly self-government. Southampton was sacked by the French in 1338, despite orders from the king to reinforce the city's defences. Edward was so pissed off by the failure of the top men in Southampton to construct these fortifications that he basically said, "Fine, I'll do it myself." Edward was an incredibly capable king for the majority of his reign. However, his legacy would have been better if he had died, say, 15 years before his actual death in 1377. Edward had become old and had suffered from a stroke, leaving him incapable. The war with France had seen the French regain nearly all the territories gained in the earlier phase of the war, and the people of England were suffering from a variety of issues, which would culminate in the Peasants' Revolt, or the Year of the Discontented People, in 1381, by which time Edward was long dead, but his successor was a boy king, Richard II. Number 6. Henry V. My own bias here. I just like the reign of Henry V, conquering France, one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe at the time, and cementing his legacy as one of England's finest warrior kings at the Battle of Agincourt, alongside the famous longbowmen of South Wales, Lancashire and Cheshire. The news of the victory reached the capital, London, on the 29th of October, 1415, and a great joy was had by the people, and on the morrow of the apostles Simon and Jude, the said Nicholas Wooton, mayor, and the aldermen, together with an immense number of the commonalty of the citizens of the city aforesaid, going on pilgrimage, went on foot to Westminster, and have first made devout thanksgiving with due solemnity in the minster there, for the joyous news that had then arrived the said Nicholas Wooton was by the said alderman and commonalty presented before the barons of the exchequer of our Lord the King at Westminster, omitted and sworn. Basically, everyone was happy in London and they all had a massive party. What you're looking at is Wells Cathedral, shot on my Canon video camera, which has a 20x optical zoom. Now, one thing I've been focusing on the last few years is having my own collection of stock footage of historical sites. Now, as you can imagine, visiting these places costs time and money. You can support these endeavors by supporting my Patreon or YouTube channel membership. When you sign up, you'll get behind the scenes content, updates, and special videos. In fact, after I'm done with this video, I'll be making a special video for supporters on the Kings of England who didn't appear on both the best and worst Kings of England video and why. So if you'd like to support the channel, that would be great, and thank you to those that do. Moving on to the number 5 pick. Number 5, Henry VII, the king who ended the War of the Roses and brought peace and stability back to England, which can be also credited to his wife, Elizabeth of York, the daughter of Edward IV, thus uniting the red and white rose. Henry's reign can be summarized by fear, monstrous expectation, and a daunting task of establishing a new dynasty, which Henry achieved. Henry had won the throne from Richard III, the last Plantagenet king, but now he had to rule England, and Henry had never been taught how to be a king. Not only that, but he had to unite England by marrying a Plantagenet princess, Elizabeth of York. Thankfully, the arranged marriage turned into a loving one, and the union was fruitful, securing the future of the Tudor dynasty. But despite having an heir by 1486, Henry still had to deal with nobles who saw him as a pretender. This is why I rank Henry so highly, is how he overcame these challenges. An aspect of kingship I rank highly is how a king deals with revolts, and Henry crushed them, most notably at the Battle of Stoke Field. But for a good part of Henry's reign, plots and intrigue of betrayal were present. The stress and paranoia would affect how Henry ruled, as he's often referred to as a cold and astute king. Henry did what was needed to restore England to peace and prosperity for the people of England. Number 4. Edgar the Peaceful. One of the most dominant and powerful kings of England. Edgar's reign is a rare period of peace in the Viking Age, and is considered a golden age for Anglo-Saxon England. Edgar inherited the whole kingdom aged 16 and ruled from 959 to 975. All the sources around Edgar's time and after praise him to the highest esteem. Later chroniclers would do the exact same thing, offering immense praise for Edgar. My favourite account that glorifies King Edgar comes from John of Worcester, writing in the 12th century. King Edgar the Peaceful, imperial monarch of the English world, the flower and glory of a race of kings, no less famous among the English than Romulus among the Romans, Cyrus among the Persians, Alexander among the Macedonians, Arsaces among the Parthians, or Charles the Great among the Franks. That's quite a comparison with great kings of old, as most of those kings fought major battles. Edgar, from the limited information we have, never fought one battle. Instead, he gained submissions from all the kings in Britain. Edgar went even as far to name himself in the charters he issued as ruler of the whole of Albion, or king of all Britain. This claim can be seen in action by the tale of the other kings in Britain rowing Edgar along the River Dee. This was just after Edgar's grand coronation at Bath in 973. The life of St. Oswald sums up Edgar's attitude towards the other kings quite well. As a result of his abundant generosity, the kings of other peoples praised him exceedingly, and because he displayed the rage of a savage lion against his enemies, neighbouring kings and princes feared him. The reason I've placed Edgar in the number 4 slot is the fact that his reign, however much enforced peace there was, it was still peace, and as it's the Viking Age, that's the best peace for the time period. There were a few other items that place Edgar here: the work on local justice and disputes, and improvements on the mints and coinage across England. But Edgar's death in his early 30s put him out of the top 3 spot. Number 3. Henry I, the longest reigning Norman king of England for 35 years. Henry kept the peace not only in England, but later in Normandy, ruling effectively and further developing English administration with the Exchequer. Henry took the throne almost immediately after his brother William II died after a hunting accident, but at the start of Henry's reign he had to deal with his older brother, Robert Curthose, as there were plenty of nobles who sided with him for the throne. By 1101, Robert had landed in England with a huge force, and Henry had assembled his own forces. It seemed like another epic battle, similar to Hastings, was on the horizon. Thankfully, peace was arranged under the terms that Henry paid off his brother. Because Henry's position was under threat, Henry made perhaps the smartest political move of his kingship, with a marriage to a descendant of the House of Wessex, the former ruling House of England. Edith, later Matilda of Scotland, was this descendant. This meant the children from this union would have a strong claim to the throne of England, combining Henry's Norman side with the Wessex and Scottish dynasties. Henry also had himself crowned again for good measure. By 1106, Henry's control in England was secure enough to mount an invasion of Normandy against his older brother, Robert. The climactic Battle of Titchenbray, where Henry and his knights soundly defeated his brother's army. Henry had Robert imprisoned for the rest of his life. This ended any potential danger of a civil war in England, but Robert did have a son. But for the next 10 years, Henry would govern England with relatively few issues, issuing new laws for theft and implementing laws on counterfeit coins, which if broken, were brutal to the offender. Of course, it's also important to mention that while Henry's long reign was mostly peaceful for the people, especially considering how tumultuous the Middle Ages can be, the White Ship disaster is a perfect example of this, where Henry's male heir drowned and the subsequent swearing of the Baron to uphold Henry's daughter, the Empress Matilda, as ruler, failed. This would result in the civil war that would follow a few years later, the Anarchy. But if we just focus on Henry's reign, the people of England had a harsh but dependable king. The major military action of Henry's reign were always in France. There was also perhaps the best relations with Scotland in the Middle Ages, as the kings there were some of Henry's men, which included one of Scotland's best kings, King David. The issue with the succession is the lingering problem of Henry's reign. Number 2. Athelstan. You can't have the best 10 kings of England and not include the first king of the English, Athelstan, who built upon the works of his father, Edward the Elder, and his grandfather, Alfred the Great, to unite all the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and the Danelaw region of England, taking the last part of the Danelaw at York when the king there died. Athelstan is another king where chroniclers of the time and later all heap tons of praise on him, from great valor to brave and glorious, esteemed, etc. But that's pretty much it. There's hardly any substance for Athelstan's reign, which is a classic issue for most of the Anglo-Saxon kings of England. The longest part about Athelstan's reign in the Anglo-Saxon chronicles is on the Battle of Brunanburh, which is fair as it's the major battle that kept England together. The battle is recorded in a few accounts. One account I find particularly interesting is from the Annals of Ulster, an Irish source, which describes the battle as a great, lamentable, and horrible battle was cruelly fought between the Saxons and the Norsemen, in which several thousands of Norsemen, who are unaccounted, fell, but their king escaped with a few followers. A large number of Saxons fell on the other side, but Athelstan, king of the Saxons, enjoyed a great victory. I would argue that the battle being mentioned in a source not located in Britain is a testament to how significant the battle was for Athelstan's reign, as well as the future of England and its people, which Athelstan succeeded in protecting. He's revered in the town he's buried in, at Malmesbury, which in 2024 had a grand archaeological dig around Malmesbury, finding many treasures from Roman to Saxon, but sadly, they didn't find their treasured king. Number 1. Henry II. My personal favourite king of England. King Henry is, in my opinion, the ultimate definition of a medieval king, inheriting a vast amount of lands, including the Kingdom of England, as well as marrying incredibly well to gain even more land. Henry's reign features so many interesting historical characters, from Henry's determined mother, the Empress Matilda, to Henry's bold and powerful wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, plus his troublesome sons, all wanting a piece of Henry's grand empire. I love everything about Henry's reign, from the drama of his family to how he crushed his enemies and even his own family members during the Great Revolt So now I'll spend the next hour explaining why Henry is the greatest king of England. Wait a minute, what's that coming over the Glastonbury Tor? It's Richard the Lionheart, one of Henry's troublesome sons, and he's shouting that he's the greatest king of England. I do apologise, ladies and gentlemen, but I've been given new data. A poll of over 10,000 Brits on the many different monarchs of Great Britain has placed Richard as the most favourable king of the Kingdom of England. Based off that data, Richard the Lionheart is the best king of England. And on that bombshell, good night.